Great. Well, thanks for joining, everybody. I know there's some more people just joining as we're talking, but maybe I'll just start the introduction as people are joining, and just want to thank you all for taking time to come and join our webinar today. I think with increasing decentralization in a number of aspects of trial conduct and management, are EDC systems still relevant? And if so, how can EDC systems address the evolving requirements of modern clinical trials? So that's what we're here to discuss. And in our discussion today, we'll explore how EDC can support modern working practices and modern trial designs. If you go to the next slide, please. So specifically in this webinar, we're going to look at 4 different themes over our time today. We'll explore direct data capture, or eSource, and whether this plays an increasing role in today's clinical trials. We'll look at the practice of remote SDV, source data verification, and that's something we saw accelerate during the pandemic, and we'll look at some of the practicalities of that, and particularly perhaps from a site perspective. We'll explore how or if EDC systems are able to support increasing implementation of decentralized elements in clinical trials, such as remote assessments and at-home data capture. And then finally, we'll explore the future of data cleaning with the increasing promise that we have from artificial intelligence and machine learning, and how EDC systems might support these new approaches. So if you go to the next slide, please. I think before I introduce the panel, just a few housekeeping items. We're going to be asking a number of polls throughout today's webinar, and you can see there on the bottom left of the screen there's a QR code. Please scan that now if you're able to do that with the camera on your smartphone, or go to that link, thepollev.com/signand866, and that will enable you to participate. We'll have a poll in about 2 minutes time. So when we pull the polls up, you'll also see the QR code on the screen again and the link. So if you haven't had time to capture it just yet, you'll have time during the poll itself. Ask questions, please, throughout today's webinar. So whilst there won't be any live questions, we will collect questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You'll see one that says Q&A. It's next to chat, but if you use the Q&A button, that makes it easier for us to manage the questions coming in and make sure we have time to address those at the end of the panel conversation. And then finally, as you leave the event today, we'll provide a survey, and we'd love to hear your feedback. It'll help us to improve these events moving forward. If you go to the next slide, please. So I think just before I bring the panel on and introduce you to them, and we start the main part of today, I just wanted to give a very, very quick introduction to Signand Health for anybody who hasn't perhaps come across us before or not quite sure what we do. So we're a technology and a service company. We've 20+ years of experience in producing high quality clinical evidence for submission clinical trials. We have within our expertise, we have operational experts, but also clinical, scientific and regulatory experts that help us to navigate the best solutions and the best designs for our clients. And as you'll see on the next slide, we've got a combination of evidence generation, medication management or IP delivery, and other study enablement technologies that we bring together to provide solutions and services for our customers. You go to the next slide, please. So I think, yeah, just to illustrate the sort of the backbone of that slide, in the center is the set of our solutions. So in evidence generation, we've got our eCOA solutions, clinical outcome assessments, so things like patient-reported outcomes, but also the more complex clinician ratings that you might do. And associated with that, some services around rater training and qualification, central rating and consulting, etc. We also have an EDC solution to collect clinical data, and sensors and wearables we're able to connect with as well. On the IP management side, we've got a randomization and trial supply management solution, but also an upstream supply software that enables companies to, at an enterprise level, plan the supply chain of their medications from raw ingredient through to encapsulation and packaging and labeling, etc., ready for clinical trials. And then our enabling solutions, so things like patient engagement, so components within our eCOA solution that enable us to interact better with patients and provide them with reminders and visit information as they progress through a trial. We have an e-consent solution. We're able to use video with telemedicine and do virtual monitoring. And finally, partner services. We have partner solutions that help with home health, so home visits, home nurse visits through partners, and also courier logistics, for example, for direct-to-patient medication supply. Go to the final slide. And you can see here that we've been proud to be part of the successful approvals of 28% of recent novel drug approvals across the US and the European Medicines Agency over the last 6 years. If you go to the next slide, please. So I'd really like to get into the topic now for today, and it's a real pleasure to introduce today's panel. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Bill Byram. I'm the Vice President of Product Intelligence and Positioning here at Signant Health, and I've worked in the industry for over 30 years now in clinical development, but also in eClinical. I'm joined by Jan Vriemans. Jan is our Senior Director of Global Solutions at Signant, and he's got a focus on the use of data analytics in trial oversight here at Signant Health. Jan's got over 20 years experience in senior positions in data management and in clinical systems on the sponsor side. I'm also really delighted to welcome Sven Vogelgesang, who's the executive leader in the area of clinical data sciences and clinical data management. And Sven has 28 years experience in the pharmaceutical industry, has led various global sponsor functions from knowledge management, clinical information management, to clinical data sciences and clinical data management. So Sven brings a wealth of experience to this discussion. And finally, last but not least, pleased again to welcome and introduce David Stein. David is an independent industry eClinical consultant with over 30 years experience, and some of his experience has been in developing and implementing technology solutions for biopharma companies and vendors. So again, Dave brings a wealth of experience to help with this conversation. So let's go to the first topic, and we can take the slides down now, I think, at this point. The first topic I wanted to talk about with you is direct data capture in clinical trials. And if we think about direct data capture, what we really mean is collecting data directly into a solution. So like EDC, for example. So without recording it somewhere else, actually just entering it straight into a system. So we might also refer to this as electronic source or e-source. I think the potential of direct data capture is to bring efficiencies by eliminating the transcription of data from other systems or from worksheets into our EDC systems by capturing it directly. So before we start to explore that as a panel, I'd like to ask you in the audience a poll question. So if you could bring the poll question up, please. Thank you. And we're interested to understand how much direct data capture or e-source that you're employing in your current clinical trials. And so think about a typical clinical trial and please select the percentage of the data collected by the site staff that's collected directly as e-source. So don't think about eCOA and patient diaries and the like, but all the data that's perhaps normally collected at site. What percentage would you say is collected with e-source? And we'll just give you a couple of minutes. It looks like we've got a strange distribution there, which is interesting, isn't it? But certainly it looks like there's some pioneers who are right at the top end there, and then the majority of the attendees Sven, are looking at sort of lower levels. Is that, Sven? Is this what you would have expected to see as a picture at our current state of use of direct data capture?
Yeah, I think from my point of view, I think this is in line with my expectations. Maybe the 6% or now 12% is more than 80%. Not so. So in my experience, I think the number collected directly on a tablet or other devices during the visit is still quite low. I think we made some progress, but we are not there yet. I think for site staff, it's in most cases maybe not convenient enough to enter maybe the data twice directly in the tablet and then maybe in the EHR system. So it would be better to have it directly flowing maybe from the device to the EHR and then from EHR to the EDC system. But maybe you can compare it a little bit 25 years ago or 28 years ago even, when we introduced electronic monitoring visit reports, the CRAs, they didn't want to take the laptops with them because it was too heavy and they had to replicate the data after the visit with the modem and whatever. I think now it's fully accepted because they understand what is in for them. And I think we have to work with the sites that they understand what is in for them. And of course, I think laptops are much lighter and also tablets today. So I think this will increase.
That's really interesting. And that is, it's interesting you bring the site up, because I think, let's, if we could bring the second poll up, actually, please. What we're kind of interested to understand, maybe from the audience perception, is what kind of barriers do we think sites have when we'd like them to use direct data capture? And maybe Sven touched on one or two there already, but this is going to be a word cloud. So you just type in one or two words to describe a point that you want to make, and that should start to appear on the screen. So we've got login and money. Okay. So perhaps login, are we talking about single sign-on perhaps there? I don't know. That's an interesting one. We've got a few more things coming in here. Hassle, resistance, change. Interesting. EPR. Yeah, some nice things coming in there. Training, Wi-Fi, internet. Can they be connected at the point of where they're with the patient? Training. Okay, that's been really interesting. I think we thank you for participating in that and for your comments. Dave, I'll just bring you in. Maybe those barriers. I mean, are those the kind of things that you see? What do you think when we?
Yeah, this is good. Absolutely, I see training as a big one, and change or resistance to change. A lot of sites, as we know, have their own SOPs about how they're going to see patients, how they're going to enter data. So they might have their own EHR or equivalent where they're typically used to doing that first. So that's why we're still seeing like EHR to clinical research initiatives taking place, but that integration is not, it's not simple. So also what most systems do when they're doing direct data capture, so while the patient is being seen, they're doing that at the point where they're seeing the patient, they're usually generating a PDF of that visit information, the clinical data, to then store in the EHR, but not all sites like that. And then the other issue is where they're seeing patients, they may not have connectivity. And so not all DDC solutions have an offline mode. And when they do, there's usually a checkout procedure. And then if they forget to check it back in, there has to be timeouts, to allow people back in. So it gets kind of complex. I've seen a lot of different implementations of DDC. And there are a few other potential barriers, which are great to see these coming up. But I just wanted to mention where sites do use it and adopt it, they say they really love it, because when the patient leaves, they're done with that part of the collection. Because they've had workflow controls, not letting things take place out of sequence, there's fewer protocol violations. There's also the data goes in cleaner because the real-time edit checks, because we know with EDC, it might sit there in paper charts or in EHR charts for days, weeks at times. And they hate getting the queries a month after the patient is gone, right? But here, and I know we're going to talk about remote monitoring, but that can take place in just about real time, near real time. So that feedback cycle gets cleaner data, less burden on the sites in the long run once they make that conversion, that leap over. And there's a few other things we could talk about, but I'll pause there for now.
Yeah, is there anything you wanted to bring in there, Jan? I mean, is that what you've been seeing, particularly in your sort of your past role in sort of leadership in data management on the sponsor side?
Yes, definitely. I think that what David mentioned is definitely a good summary of what we have been seeing.
Yeah, really good. Maybe we take the poll down now for a moment, but you know, maybe drill in a little bit. I think one of the things that I certainly noticed back in the day was that, you know, investigators may be quite reluctant to take on new technologies, and often the EDC, the actual mechanics of getting data into the EDC isn't done by them. It might be done by the study nurse. But do you think that in today's you know, maybe that's a viewpoint I might have had 10 or 15 years ago. Do you think today doctors and consultants and clinicians are more likely to be already using, you know, some sort of tablet or device or whatever in their routine care with the patient, and it would be a less of a big leap to adopt a solution to do direct data capture whilst they're, you know, consulting with a patient? Is that a possibility?
Yeah, Bill. Yeah, I think so. I think we're seeing a lot more where they're comfortable using technology. But I've seen two models. One where some who might not have been used to it, you know, doing that two-finger approach. I've also seen where they'll bring interns into the room and almost like transcription, real-time transcription. They'll have them do it, but the PI is right there. So those are two models I've seen. But I agree with your point. I think they are much more used to using electronic systems of all types.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would definitely agree to that. If you go into hospital nowadays, day-to-day care, you see the nurses walk around with carts with laptops, physicians with a tablet and so on. So the burden to say we can't use technology in hospital, those days are past.
Yeah.
And from my point of view, what I saw even looking at EHR to EDC, for example, I saw even sites developing their own solutions. So they are really keen to save time. And I think this will evolve over time.
Yeah. When we think about enabling that then with a solution, you know, can we use any EDC solution as a DDC, as a direct data capture solution, or are there particular features that we need to be thinking about that system must have to enable that to be used effectively? I think, Dave, I saw you shaking your head there. So
I've seen that mistake made. We're going to do EDC on tablets, and that's DDC. No way.
Yeah. Okay.
The first point is, and then there's some great reflection papers on this, and EMA put out, that what do they call their qualification opinion document, which is excellent on DDC. So some of the requirements just around the regulatory environment, the typical EDC isn't going to do it. So, for example, the monitor as a sponsor user is going to need to see the entire eSource database. The clinical database is just a portion of that. I'll give a quick simple example. So if the protocol says take 3 blood pressures 2 minutes apart, the DDC would capture all of that raw data, the exact date timestamp, and make sure it's 2 minutes apart. If the investigator tries to do it too quickly, it might flash a soft warning, that type of thing. We don't see that in EDC, right? It's not taking place real time. But then what goes to the clinical database may just be the average of those 3 readings, not the raw source data. But the monitor is going to need to see that, right? And the site is responsible to retain that on a local copy that they have complete control over for the duration of the trial, and then for it to be inspection ready thereafter. Now, that's just a few of there's a lot more. I already mentioned a greater need for offline. And then one other thing I think is important, if you think of like a phase 1 or early phase 2 study where they might have a cohort of patients coming in, all being done for vital signs, let's say, within form navigation to bring up next patient, within a form, that's not typical in an EDC design. There may be some that are better than others at that. In DDC, it's essential. So there's a lot more, but I've seen that mistake. Try to just use it any EDC, and it's not going to be effective.
That's interesting what you say. So, I mean, I guess in phase one in particular, you're going to have those, like you say, those cohorts going through. And I think what you were referring to there was the sort of the navigation of normally you go through a sequence at a patient level. And what you're talking about is going through a procedure level
Exactly.
across a groups of patients. That's very interesting, Dave.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe to add a couple of things on. I mean, if you look at the history of EDC, we have always come from the transcribed data entry model, and EDCs have become very efficient in that process. So getting data in, being efficient on the data entry side purely as such, but we have not necessarily been thinking much about building the workflows and building the guidance in for the sites. So this is where we're gonna have to make a difference when we want to move from EDC into direct data capture or into true e-source models.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, let's move a little bit. We touched on it slightly in this section about remote SDV, and I think Dave, you were talking about the EHR records, etc. So let's think about that a little bit. And I think when I talk about remote SDV or source data verification, I'm really talking about enabling that source data verification activity to be conducted away from the site. And so, maybe the CRA can do it from home without needing to actually visit the site. So there needs to be a mechanism or an ability of the sites to provide access to or to copies of records of source data that can be remotely accessed by the CRA. So I think for obvious reasons, we saw a big increase in the demand for remote SDV during the pandemic, obviously because of the difficulty that CRAs would have actually visiting hospitals, etc. Do we see this, Jan? Are we seeing this trend continuing, since the pandemic?
I would definitely believe that this trend will be continuing. Now we're talking about remote SDV. We have already been reducing the level of SDVs in the past with central monitoring, which is also a way of remote working. Now, COVID obviously forced us to do things remotely. Legislators, regulators have been accepting that for the sake of the pandemic. But they are actually lagging behind to a certain extent. So the amount of clarification that we get in that respect is not necessarily so great yet on what is really needed when you consider remote SDV. In some countries, for example, if you take the EU, there's a bunch of EU countries that are still not officially accepting it, while there's many others that by default would accept remote access to source data, source documents. If you would take it from a general perspective, and I'm pretty sure that in clinic, investigators, everybody is eager to make their life simpler. And remote SDV can help us to reduce travel costs, to be more flexible, and so on. So, and we got used to that. So people will definitely want to go there, will try to go there. And it's going to be important that we can also give out the reassurance that the data stays safe and that we respect the privacy. So that's going to be crucial, that whatever we do, whenever we start sharing source documents, or whether we give access for a monitor to an EHR, that there is that full transparency on security, privacy of the data, that nothing can go wrong. If you would indeed take it, say, we go more about sharing source documents, putting them into a platform, which your EDC could, for example, have this kind of document exchange capabilities, it's going to be that same principle. Can we ensure that the investigator stays in full control of what he's uploading, that it doesn't start flying around throughout the system, throughout other people? Can he also retain that control over the document? So can he say, well, actually, Mr. or Mrs. CRA, you've had your time to do your source data verification. You no longer need that document, so why should I leave that on the system, or why should you constantly be able to access that data? So there's a lot of things that we have to really consider from that perspective. And I'm pretty sure that regulators will be giving more and more guidance, maybe after the fact, while they see cases coming in. But I think it's really all about that privacy, security, and compliance that we have to keep in mind, and that we actually are going to be reassuring the sites that this is okay, because they're the first ones to have to accept this as well, obviously.
And I think that privacy point is really interesting, and I'm aware that at the during the pandemic, what one solution that was put in place by some sites was to provide a sort of guided access to the EHR system. So maybe the EHR was being shared over a screen share, and but it was being operated by somebody on the site side, taking the CRA through the screens they needed to see. And I'm aware that CRAs had to sign additional consent forms, permission forms to do that, to guarantee that they would always be in a private room with nobody looking over their shoulder, that they wouldn't be taking screenshots or screen shares, etc., of the information. So, really interesting. But that's one approach. Are there other ways, Jan, that EDC systems can facilitate remote SDV?
I would definitely indeed think about far more about using your EDC and have a kind of document or data upload capability where you say,
Right.
as an investigator or study nurse, you can upload something into the EDC that is then enabled for view rights to the CRA. Now, why would I see that versus having access to the EHR? If you go into, for example, remotely into an EHR, then you're dependent on what are the capabilities of the EHR. Can you have a independent read-only access? Or do you want to do something remotely and you're going to set up a Zoom or a Teams call with the study nurse to look at the screen? Well, then we're honestly not saving anything. We're probably making life even more cumbersome than it already is to the study nurses. Secondly is that EHR it's an important source of your data, but it's not necessarily the only thing a CRA needs to see during the monitoring visit. I mean, there's pharmacy notes, there is so much more beyond that. So whatever you do, it's never going to be just about EHR. And if you say you take kind of like an secure upload principle, any kind of document, any kind of data type could in principle be shared with the CRA. If you do that, definitely things that I would find important is it should be as simple as possible for study coordinators, study nurses, investigators to upload that document, to control that document. They should be able to provide additional explanations whenever they feel that that is needed onto a document, and don't assume that every document is self-explanatory. And there should be a very clear process on what's the access restrictions, and that should be clear, not just on the sponsor side, but obviously on the site side as well, including like what is that temporal access? Can we take the document completely out where you just retain metadata, or are they able to potentially say as an investigator, I turn the access on documents on and off, for example? So those are a couple of elements. You can even think about, is it permitted to purely view the document versus are there specific cases, but then we're no longer talking about SDV, maybe to say, well, actually we share something that could have a download, that would need a download capability. In terms of SOR documents, downloading it would probably create a lot of concerns from the regulators.
And I know, Sven, this is probably more of a clinical operations rather than a clinical data management area of involvement. But have you seen this? Particularly through the pandemic, perhaps. Have you seen this being adopted and used successfully?
I think what I've seen was of course remote SDV and remote visits, etc. And I think this is I think everybody sees that you can save a lot of money with this and it's more efficient. Where you have to be careful, from my point of view, is a little bit that also when we introduced risk-based monitoring, for example, with reduced site visits, I think we've seen some sites that were not reacting anymore so fast or whatever. So it was always a good thing to be on site, and then there was a kind of sense of urgency. I think this is key. I have not seen solutions to upload something into the EDC. I think it's difficult from my point of view because you are not allowed to collect more data than described in the protocol. So this is a thing where you have to be careful.
That's interesting. And what about the sites? Jan, we're putting burden back onto them. I mean, I remember when we first introduced EDC, we took data entry from the teams, the double data entry teams at sponsor organizations to now expect the study nurse to key the stuff in. And now if we're doing the same with SGV, saying, look, you need to collect the source data and provide it in a way that it can be remotely monitored, are we not just putting more burden on them?
That is indeed a risk because, I mean, let's be honest, all pharma companies, CROs, we have a tendency to first look at our own efficiencies, whether that was about EDC implementation, whether that was about risk-based monitoring. It was typically always thinking, what can we save as an industry? And we were often forgetting about what is it for the sites. It really has to be as easy as possible for them, has to be not more difficult for them than to have somebody coming on site and taking some of their time. So that's definitely something that we need to be cautious. In terms of coming back to the point that Sven raised about, can you attach something? Well, there have been remote monitoring concepts already where there was a dedicated separated file server kind of system, which also gave that capability to say, actually, as a site, you can upload documents, you can grant access to documents via something like that. And attaching it to the EDC would still be following that same principle with only access for the CRA, so it's fully rights restricted. And of course, it should be taken out when it's no longer needed, so that ultimately, the only evidence that should retain, from my personal perspective, would be metadata. So that's really only available remotely when needed and no longer than needed as well. But it's indeed making sure that the sites can really easily do this, easily get something in, easily get something out, and that it's not taking any burden to them.
Yeah, and we probably need to, we need to be willing to pay them for their time if it's taking
we
them
might
more
have
time,
to do
right?
that. We might have to indeed think about what are we saving as an industry versus does that mean we need to compensate the sites if they do something for that?
Yeah. Did you want to add anything, Dave? I know we're going to move on to the next topic.
Yeah, quickly. I just saw an interesting comment that assumes when we're using DDC for that portion, that is eSource. So you check against, right? So that's an accurate comment. And the related question there is, how are regulatory bodies reacting to not having source other than what was put in the DDC system? Well, that is the source. So how are they reacting? I mentioned briefly, like in 2010, the EMA reflection paper. In 2013, FDA eSource guidance. They touch on that. They're open to it. They acknowledge that becomes the source, and so it does remove the. And then again, I mentioned that 2019 EMA qualification on qualification review of DDC.
Yeah.
They all touch on that, and it's accepted.
Yeah, I think in the latest guidelines from EMA that came out on DCT and computerized systems, they are clearly open to direct data capture. That's definitely something that they reinforce. I think it's for them important that if there is something extra needed, that sites don't forget to capture whatever is needed from a medical perspective, from the care of the patient. And they definitely do emphasize that they still believe that EHR is an important aspect to have data for the sites as well, especially from the European perspective. So is there the full direct data capture? That's for me also a question. I think that goes back to the first poll. There's definitely always going to be a portion of direct data capture. Whether we're going to be seeing studies that do like 80, 90, 100%, I think at this moment, and maybe the next couple of years to come, that's going to be limited. So I suspect that we're going to be living in a world where we are slowly increasing the amount of direct data entry into the system within a study. And that is going to be for CRAs working with a mix of paper-based data entry or data entry based on what's in the EHR versus what's directly entered.
Yeah, spot on, I think that. Thank you. Thanks, Dave and Jan. Let's move on to the third part of the agenda, which was to think about decentralized trials and the sort of what we're seeing in terms of increasing decentralization. And I guess the question really is how can or should EDC be used to enable patient assessments and patient consultations in different settings away from the site. So, an example would be, a remote consultation via video, or perhaps an even, different example would be an at-home nurse visit where the nurse is perhaps doing some assessments or collecting some data. Can EDCs support that, or do we need to use different data capture solutions for that? Can we do it all within the one EDC solution?
Bill, you're actually giving a couple of different scenarios out here in one.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, I think you can think about, or the question for me would be, why would this not be possible? For example, we have been doing remote follow-up visits in the past. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, we simply had protocols where it says like, well, dear Mr. Investigator or Mr. Investigator, please have a telephone visit with the patient to do a safety follow-up and have a couple of relevant questions being asked as your last visit. We did those. We didn't have any real problems with that. We submitted those data to agencies, so that was all accepted. So by itself, remote consultations are not a problem, and it's a matter of like having that EDC system working along with either video consultations from the site itself. You can go for a full separated, dedicated solution, but then the question is, what complexity are you building in? Or you can think about EDC systems or platforms where you have an EDC component that offer you also a kind of like a televisit, telehealth component along with it, so that at least if you don't have something for yourself as a site, that you have something that's easy to use, that's directly accessible from within the system, but back to the ease of use, and that may help you. For example, if you have it as an integrated module, for example, as an add-on to your EDC, can you have your pre-scheduled visits with an alert as part of your calendar so that it's directly visible for the site what they have to do, that they have to have an appointment video-wise with a patient. Same for the patient. Does he have that reminder? Or where you can say, oh, the patient is calling up. Well, actually, I would rather be seeing my patient so that I also can have a better conversation. Can you do something ad hoc? That doesn't have to be so complex to build such video capabilities as an add-on to your DDC or an EDC, in my opinion.
And what about the nurse visits? Can we? How would an EDC support that? I guess, but back to Sven's points at the beginning. Things are becoming more. Computers are getting smaller. We could do things on tablets. We could do things on mobile phones. Can we use those to have a site nurse? If they've got to weigh or take vital signs or do some other things with the patient at home, can they use a direct data capture of that using their EDC solution, perhaps on a mobile device, for example?
I would definitely say yes, but you have to build you have to have a solution that gives you the appropriate flow, and that's easy enough to use for the nurses. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that if we think about a DDC for something that we use fully in clinic, and that is your main interface, you need to think about who needs to answer all the queries. The investigator is going to get the queries. Where is he addressing the queries? Do we just leave them on the EDC side? Do we push data corrections over to the DDC side? Because ultimately, if he's changing something, he's changing his source, so he might want to see the question, or he needs to justify why he's changing something in his DDC side as well. If you're talking about sending dedicated home nurses out, they're simply going to be doing the data correction. The question is, do they need all the whistles and bells in terms of that functionality? Because ultimately, they do that on behalf of the investigator, and they may have to just have pretty much a data entry correction, data change corrections, data change capabilities, obviously, for whatever happens on site. But as soon as they have come back, do they need to look back at the data, do some reporting, or is that given back to the investigator? That's something where you need to think carefully about and make sure that your system has the appropriate design for those specific visits.
That's interesting. And I know, we're talking about trying to shoehorn this into a single solution, but that isn't always possible. And we've certainly seen the trend with decentralization that we're seeing more and more increasing numbers of external data sources being used in our in our clinical trials. And I think I'd like to ask Sven about this, but just before I do, perhaps we could bring up another poll question for the audience, because we'd kind of love to hear your views on clinical trials and the use of the increasing number of data sources that we're seeing. So, maybe think about into which systems would you prefer to integrate your non-case report form data? Would it be into EDC? Would it be straight into the clinical data repository? Would you keep them as separate files typically, or maybe there's another approach that you use? And again, if you can just begin to answer that poll, that would be really, really helpful. And the QR code is at the top of the screen, along with the link to that poll as well. So I'm not quite sure if we've got 100% whether we've just got one person answering or whether everybody's answering that. We don't have an N here, which is a bit of a limitation, isn't it, of our polling system? Oh, here we go.
Data's coming in.
There we go. That's better. That looks a bit more what we might expect. Okay, I mean, Sven, just maybe as the results are coming in, is this the sort of pattern you expect, and what's your opinion on, on where data should go when we've got these multiple data sources?
Yeah, so far I think I like the result. I think what we've seen in the past, the number of the external non-CF data was rapidly increasing over the last years. So in my experience, I saw 60 up to 80% of the data points in a clinical trial coming from non-CF data sources. For example, in oncology, it's quite high. And also the number of different data sources per trial is also increasing. So I saw on average 6 to 12 different data sources that need to be integrated. So this can be lab data, eCOA, ePro, independent read results, imaging, wearables, whatever. I think the good thing is that this data is e-source, so maybe created electronically by tools, machines, lab devices, and whatever. So there's no manual data entry or transcription process necessary. So it's more a question of reconciliation than data cleaning or query management. And I think important for a modern EDC system is the ability to have it intelligently connected to a clinical data repository, a clinical data management system, data management workbench or whatever, allowing the queries to be raised also within the CDR, and then flowing via EDC to the site. For me, the EDC system is still the main connection to the site and investigator for data entry. But from my point of view, the center of the clinical data flow is the clinical data repository or CDMS or whatever, because I see that there are much more advantages to have a direct integration into these kind of tools. And only for some of the data sources, I see the advantage if the data flows first into the EDC system. Like, for example, maybe e-consent, some questionnaires, if it makes sense, and lab standard units and these kind of things.
Yeah, and maybe there's the different users involved here, Sven. So I guess, as you were saying, the EDC is really the interface for the investigator. So when it comes to their oversight of the patient, I guess it's convenient to have as much of the data as possible in there for them to be able to do that in one place. Whereas, back at the pharma company, you've got the statistical reviewer, the medical reviewer, and they as well want to see a consolidated set of data, but it might be more convenient for them to see it in the CDR. Is that what you're saying? Or
yeah. And in the CDR you can have analytical tools, maybe looking at trends, etc., and then ask. But I made a survey last year and asked 14 sponsor companies where they raised their queries, and 71% said in this survey that they exclusively raise and manage the queries in the EDC, and only 29% said we raise it in the CDR and the EDC. So I think still a long way to go, and I think if more and more sophisticated CDR solutions come to the market and it's easier to connect the systems, and this is what I expect from a modern EDC, then I think this last number of 29% will raise.
Yeah, Bill, maybe to add, I mean, Honestly, or conceptually, I definitely agree with what Sven is saying. I'm also a strong believer that your non-CRF data should go into a data lake or CDMS or anything like that, with one exception. If you want the investigator to have visibility on the data, or if you want the investigator to take action on central data, then it is worthwhile to definitely put them in the EDC, so that EDC becomes a main interface, a main front end for site staff and for the investigators. But if we say this is not so relevant, we don't want them to take action on this or to really review the data and give us evidence of that review, then I wouldn't take it into a backend where I have all the computing power and all the analytics and future-wise artificial intelligence to process and learn about the data.
Yeah. And there's lots of other solutions that we ask the site to use. So, and we ask the patient to use. So we've got e-consent, we've got eCOA, we've got randomization, trial supply management. And so, what's important for EDC as it plays within that broader ecosystem? So it's not just about bringing the data together, but, is it more important to make sure we've got a single sign-on environment, or that we're able to move data between the systems so they don't have to do duplicate activities in multiple places? Or, what do you see in terms of how an EDC and specifically should play within a sort of an ecosystem of products?
Yeah, I think an interesting question. It's difficult to say what is most important, but I think EDC is an essential part of the data acquisition process in a clinical trial. And as I said, I think it's the main interface to the investigator and sites for data entry. And our goal should always be to decrease the site burden. And so what does this mean for EDC? I think single sign-on, of course, reduces site burden by maybe integrating EDC into an investigator portal. I think an EDC system needs this flexibility to connect, and I repeat myself, to a kind of CDR, data management workbench solution, that the queries and also the issues maybe flow between these systems and then via EDC to the investigator. I think an interface would also be good to standard management tools, clinical metadata repositories, where you can then really use a standard library and build automatically your CRFs and database database setups to reduce the cycle times. And what I also see is e-consent integration makes a lot of sense, because this also reduces the site burden. There's no need anymore to enter in the CRF consent number, consent details, etc., which is really painful. We introduced consent number scanners and these kind of things in the past. So this would be automatically generated. So I think this would be really of help when thinking about a modern EDC system.
Yeah, Bill, if I follow up, I agree. And I think we have to keep in mind the regs all require the PI has to be in control of the data, all the data taking place. So that's a critical element. What does control mean? Well, there's quite a lot involved there. So what I'm seeing as the big challenge is not so much that, there's a lot of smart people and good technologies out there to implement these things, but then we find like a site will have their own televisit software. Do they want to use the one that's integrate, right? And they have their own calendaring system and set up for appointments, and so it's all separate already, and they have their own SOPs and what. But the other things I'm seeing is it's been interesting. I'm sure a lot of those who are online with us now have gone through the FDA guidance from this year in June on DCTs, and so some of the things there they mentioned, the PI is also responsible for anything that's taking place remotely. That they use the term delegates to an HCP. Are they really delegating, or is the sponsor kind of making that available? They don't want to, they acknowledge, regulators that is, acknowledge there will be variability potentially there when it's done by a healthcare practitioner outside the PI's office. The PI, though, may oversee this by video conference, but how realistic is that in coordinating the timing and their valuable? These are things that are in the draft document. We have a chance to comment on that. And the HCPs, we're asked, if we're using them, not to have them deviate from the way they normally do things in everyday practice. So even though they're trained, they may be trained, for example, how to key something into, we used to use the term portal, or to an EDC extension, but we don't want them to be modifying their services that they're providing on a day-to-day basis. And so there's a lot of other things around it. But yeah, I think you want to move on now to the next topic.
Well, I do. Well, we could talk about that one for a long time. And that guidance you cite was super interesting. It was very helpful. It's good that it's only draft, but it has some really interesting points in it. And I think one of the sentences that struck me was, and it links to what you were saying, was that the investigator should consider the patient's home as an extension of the site when we're doing these things with the patient at home. And what does that even mean? Is really interesting. But let's go on to that final topic, because I know we are running short of time now, and I do want to just touch on the kind of the innovations that we see in data management and data cleaning, and specifically those which artificial intelligence and machine learning might show some promise. And so maybe we could just very quickly ask our final poll of the audience, and I'm interested to understand what your perception is and what your actual use is of artificial intelligence and machine learning. It's got the potential to automate and accelerate aspects of the data cleaning process, but are you already using AI and ML to support data cleaning in some way? And the options here: yes to detect potential issues in data, yes to create queries, yes to both of those, or no, not at all. It'd be great to see your answers. And I think, again, Sven, maybe over to you as these are coming in. What's your perception of that from what you've seen in the industry as well?
Yeah. Okay. Interesting question. I think nowadays no discussion without AI and machine learning or whatever. So thinking about how we can improve data querying, data cleaning with these kind of new technologies, I think we maybe have to think a little bit about the efficiency of a query. So in 2020, some industry colleagues and myself, we published a paper in the Journal of the Society for Clinical Data Management. It was about risk-based quality management in clinical data management, and we looked there at 20,000 patients, 50 million data points to see how efficient queries are. And the result was that only 1.7% of the entered data was changed by a query. So I think the question is, do we really need all these queries? And maybe here AI and machine learning can play a role. They could detect the importance of the queries and the efficiency. Has this changed in the past? A data point, is this important, etc. I think also AI could help in setting up the database and CFs, taking the standards automatically out of the standards library, already programming the database, etc. I think where it also can help AI is phrasing the queries, because I think lots of problems or queries we have because of bad query text that is not clear. And I think language model and AI could help the medics or data managers to rephrase the wording, standardize it, and make it easier to understand by the sites, which will then reduce site burden, reduce requeries, and free up resources.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you touched on a few things there, and obviously that the use of it to take a protocol and generate generate part of or all of an EDC system with all the database and the forms that's needed would be very, very interesting. And I think if we think about it from a data cleaning perspective and the querying perspective, do you see EDC systems evolving to contain those AI or ML modules or components within them, or do you see those things being done external and feeding into EDC so that the EDC can take the outputs of some sort of artificial intelligence solution?
Yeah, good question. What I've seen is that some data management workbench providers, etc., start offering these AI solutions.
Yeah.
But I think, for example, looking at queries and maybe also doing some analysis on KPIs, like, I don't know, database data entry timeliness or something like this. I think this could also be done in the EDC system. So I think it will be maybe a combination of solutions in both areas, EDC and the CDR.
Yeah, thank you. Dave, Jan, have you got any observations or points you want to? Yeah.
Quickly, I thought those were great points that Sven made, and I can see AI looking at which edit checks are firing more often than others, and then therefore where are we really getting the value? Because these edit checks have the potential to slow a system. And then there's also I know we weren't really talking about the build portion, but seeing how they could build, because it's not just EDC, it's the ancillary areas like randomization, trial supply management, where AI, I'm starting to see a lot of models where AI is able to analyze that, like in a typical trigger resupply model, where it can break down those trigger and resupplies into more granular, not just high, low, medium recruiting sites, but all types of across the spectrum. So we're really seeing the ability for it to enhance. But real quickly on the cleaning, I think because looking at all the regs that are coming out about use of AI in clinical research, that's looked at as low risk because it's back end and you're not driving decisions that affect patient safety. I think your question, I'm seeing that starting to evolve, and whether it's built into the system natively or as like web services or things that could be hooked in, it really doesn't matter. For in the end of the day, it looks like it's baked into the system, and I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the next few years.
Yeah, and I think Sven made a very interesting point about the amount of queries that's resulting in a real correction of data. It is indeed true that we have often been asking queries to confirm data in a lot of cases, and we need to be cautious when we start looking at AI models that we are not creating even more queries, because it's so easy to get signals out, and that we're not just starting to increase the number of queries. We should rather be focusing on asking the right queries. So AI should also help us, or data models should also help us to constantly measure our effectiveness on what is really happening and are queries really worthwhile. Because if we simply bump them out, bump the numbers up, then we are taking away, and then we're increasing the burden on the site staff, and then we're simply lowering quality in the end. So that's going to be, I think, critical as well, that we really careful about which queries we ask and how many queries we need to ask in the study, because we have definitely been overdoing.
Yeah, that's a great point. And look, I know we're kind of almost at the time. That's been a really super conversation, and we've had one or two things through the Q&A. I think actually Dave addressed one of those points already as we went through. So as people registered for this, they did actually provide some questions, and one of the questions, and maybe this is a good one to finish on because it's quite a high level question, is what are the 3 must-haves for an EDC? So maybe I could ask each of you just to think, what would be the 3 most important things that you would look for? And it's a bit unfair because I know you weren't expecting that question, but so maybe I'll start with Jan to give Sven and Dave a bit more time. But what top 3, Jan, features or must-haves for an EDC?
Well, the real must-haves are the things that we have already had in EDC. So I would want to revert this a little bit and think about what are the new capabilities that we're looking at. Okay. And that is definitely have the ability to build workflows much more into EDC systems. Definitely be able to support the SDV in a better way. So targeted SDV, start building out capabilities for remote SDV, because that's going to be coming up with some requirements. And as a third one, need to think a little bit.
Don't worry, I think those are good ones.
The videos.
The video. All right. Okay.
The video capabilities.
Great points, and I like the fact you're looking at the newer features, because actually there's a lot of stuff which is just common to all EDCs that we kind of take for granted at this point.
I mean, of course they do data entry.
Yeah, right, exactly. Dave, did you have any must-haves?
I'm just going to go with one in addition to
Yes.
this is not new, but it's become, I'm just going to say integration, data exchange capability.
Okay.
We touched on that in several ways today. And in my mind, it was just the best model for like some kind of middleware piece, but orchestrated integration. And that includes pushing data from EDC and pulling it in. And because just one final thing about the regs, they say that there has to be one central physical location, an investigator or inspector rather could sit down and review everything. How you do that integration.
Very good. Sven, I think you get the last word.
Yeah, so for me, the top 3 features are connectivity and integration, because we need to connect to different systems, flexibility to support different hybrid operating models, hybrid data acquisition, some automatic, some still good old data entry, fast development and deployment to support really fast changes during the trial, because I've never seen a trial without an amendment.
Yes.
And maybe a 4th one, costs, because I think it doesn't need to fit to, it does have to fit to what you are doing. So a phase 4 observational trial doesn't need a Ferrari or whatever, it needs a smaller system.
Got you. That's great. Well, look, that's a great place to finish. And so it just leaves me to thank this wonderful panel, Sven, David, and Jan. Thank you very much for your time. And for all those who've joined online, I hope you enjoyed today. Thank you for participating as well. So thank you, and have a great day.